to the January meeting of Minnesota Atheists. Thank you for joining us today. Today's presentation is by August. It will be presented by August Berkshire. He is speaking on the necessity of atheism by Percy Bysshe Shelley. So, like in 1811, at the age of 18, the English romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, aided by his friend Thomas Hogg, they published an essay in a pamphlet form entitled The Necessity of Atheism. This led to their expulsion from Oxford College. 2 years later, Shelley expanded the essay as part of the notes to his poem, Queen Mab. Prior to the publication of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin in 1859, publicly declaring oneself an atheist was a rare and scandalous. Though famous as a lyrical poet, Shelley was equally interested in science and philosophy. August, he is a past president, past longtime board member of Minnesota Atheists, and he's done a lot of research on this. And so I will give the floor over to August to give his presentation. Thank you, August.
Okay, well, thank you, Heather. I first started this at the request of the Toastmasters, Free Thought Toastmasters. Wanted a short presentation, and so a number of months ago I put this together, and then we needed a speaker for this month, and so I've expanded it a little since the Toastmaster presentation. So The Necessity of Atheism by Percy Bysshe Shelley. Now, don't know why I'm not able to forward the slides. Let's see, you were screen sharing, stop sharing.
Maybe if you just press the space bar or
yep, that's it. Yeah, I don't know how I would go back. So, oh yes,
maybe arrows would do that too.
Wait, no, I think I got it. There we go. So Shelley, he was born shortly after the start of the French Revolution, and the spirit of the French Revolution continued for decades. This sort of revolutionary spirit. Born in a town south of London, you can see at the bottom of the page here, quite a big estate. He came for money. He got an excellent education. Some of the poems that he's known for, Queen Mab, probably his most famous one is Ozymandias. Some of you might have heard of that. Ode to the West Wind, Skylark. Number of essays that he's known for, Necessity of Atheism, probably a defense of poetry might be the other one he's most well known for. If we were meeting in person, I would have samples of his poetry that I would pass out. As it is, I guess I could, if anyone wants the samples of his poetry that I put together, I'm happy to send them to you as a PDF. Maybe I can send the PDF files to Minnesota Atheists. They can post them on Meetup, so we could distribute them that way. Oh, now the forward key is working. These are some images of Shelley through the years. Now you may wonder why in the lower right corner, this runs the gamut of most of his life, why he's still looking so young. Well, that's because he died when he was 29, so that's as old as he ever looked. These are some of the philosophers that influenced Shelley, especially the British and French empiricists. And some of the big ones were Spinoza, Baron de Holbach, and David Hume. And I think most atheists have not heard of Baron de Holbach. He's maybe because he wrote in French. But in my research, he turned out to be quite an interesting person, and I'll probably end up putting together a presentation on him sometime in the future. Shelley quotes from him at length in The Necessity of Atheism, and you'll see he's pretty devastating on God belief. Now, what did Shelley mean by atheism and spirit? He sometimes talked about spirit or universal spirit. What did he mean by that? And it's not too clear because he sort of changed a little bit over the years. But the atheist's power to shock, thrill, and offend people continually delighted him. He once replied to a friend, "I took up the word atheist as a knight took up a gauntlet in defiance of injustice." And his atheism was mainly directed at the contradictions and evils of Christianity. One thing that really set him off on this was when he was about 17, 18, he became engaged. I don't know if it was kind of an unofficial engagement to a young girl named Harriet Grove. But of course, Shelley had pretty radical ideas about religion and free love and everything. And Harriet's father broke off the engagement, refused to let his daughter marry Shelley. And Shelley was really heartbroken and just royally pissed at the judgmentalism of Christianity. And a lot of us, we can relate in our adolescence, we just get really pissed off at Christianity too. And we just get a sort of mad at Christianity attitude and just come out with both guns blazing. And that's kind of what Shelley did. However, he did not deny whatever power and mystery might lie behind the universe. He simply disagreed that this great system of things was designed by one intellectual being. So the spirit existed as an integral part of the universe, not separate from it, like cosmic microwave background radiation is part of the universe, permeates the universe. So the spirit did not create the universe nor anything in it. And rather, the universe and the spirit have always existed together. Shelley thought the universe had always existed, or at least that should be our default position. Now, another way to look at his idea of spirit, so-called spirituality, was this is from a poem he wrote after the death of John Keats. "He is made one with nature. There is heard his voice in all her music, in the moan of thunder, to the song of night's sweet bird. He is a presence to be felt and known in darkness and in light, from herb to stone." So he did think that there was some sort of essence of us that lived on, but there was no God overseeing it. It was just some like a human, you could say soul, spirit, whatever. And but he did not believe in deities. One of the earliest expressions that he had of his atheism, he wrote this Gothic novel in the equivalent of what would be his senior year of high school. He was 17 at Eton. And it's called Zastrozzi, a Romance, a Gothic novel, published anonymously, just his initials PBS on it, but it's sort of anonymous. And this is the modern cover. It's still in print. Probably would not be in print if he wasn't so famous for other reasons. But this kind of gives you a good feel for sort of the Gothic and the horror and the creepiness that are in this novel written by a 17-year-old. So this is from the novel. Now, at this point, the characters, both Matilda and Zastrozzi, have been sentenced to die. So, "Matilda," replies Zastrozzi, whilst a smile of contemptuous atheism played over his features, "Matilda, fear not. Fate wills us to die, and I intend to meet death, to encounter annihilation with tranquility. Am I not convinced of the non-existence of a deity? Am I not convinced that death will but render this soul more free, more unfettered? Why need I then shudder at death? Why need anyone whose mind has risen above the shackles of prejudice, the errors of a false and injurious superstition?" So even here, he's talking about some part of us that's living on, that's going to be more free to roam the universe after we die. But again, not believing in a God. Okay. A year later, he is in Oxford. This is his freshman year in Oxford. And he writes a pamphlet, The Necessity of Atheism. There's the original cover. It's anonymous. You can see there's no name on it. And these are some of the pages from inside. So while he's at Oxford, he gets an essay from his best friend, Thomas Jefferson Hogg, an atheistic essay. And Shelley added material to it and anonymously published it as The Necessity of Atheism. They sent copies to all the bishops and the heads of houses at the college. It was advertised for sale in the Oxford University and City Herald. And it was also for sale in the window of a publisher near the college. This is an advertisement that went along with the pamphlet. As love of truth is the only motive which actuates the author of this little tract, he earnestly entreats those of his readers who may discover any deficiency in his reasonings, or may be in possession of proofs which his mind could never obtain, would offer them, together with their objections, to the public, as briefly, as methodically, as plainly as he has taken the liberty of doing, through deficiency of proof, an atheist. Okay, well, just the very day he published it, or by the next day, they were shutting it down. They went over to the store where it was being sold, and the store owner removed all copies from the windows, and most of this was an edition of 250 copies were printed at Shelley's expense. Most of them ended up getting destroyed. Shelley and Hogg get expelled from Oxford University. Shelley had refused to acknowledge that he was the author of the pamphlet, saying that he wanted to respect the author's desire for anonymity, though there was no doubt in anyone's mind that he was the author. And it was this refusal to acknowledge authorship as much as the contents of the pamphlet that got him expelled. After the expulsion, he could have been reinstated if his father had intervened, but this would have required his disavowing the pamphlet and declaring himself a Christian, and he refused. Shelley's father prohibited him from coming back home to stay, lest his ideas influence his younger sisters. Well, 2 years later, Shelley published a long poem called Queen Mab. This time he did put his name on it. Queen Mab, a philosophical poem that included a lengthy notes section at the end. So you can see a philosophical poem with notes. And it's a very long notes section. And one of the notes was the Necessity of Atheism essay from 2 years earlier that he altered a little bit, not too much, and then expanded it. He about doubled the length. He added a lot more material to it. So that's one long note at the end of the poem Queen Mab. So now I'll get into some excerpts from The Necessity of Atheism as it appeared in the notes for Queen Mab, a philosophical poem. Okay, he opens right up, there is no God. This negation must be understood solely to affect a creative deity. He means a deity that creates anything, creates the universe, creates humans, anything. The hypothesis of a pervading spirit co-eternal with the universe remains unshaken. And it's interesting, this sentence, the second sentence, was not in the original Necessity of Atheism that he had published 2 years earlier. We're not sure why he added it, maybe to make some people happy, maybe to just clarify his point. But it's an interesting addition that he would add that 2 years later. Many falsely imagine that the mind is active in belief, that belief is an act of volition, in consequence of which it may be regulated by the mind. And this is a big thing for Shelley, that you can't help whether or not you believe. Your mind takes in whatever evidence is presented to you, but whether you believe or not is not an act of will. You can't force yourself to believe. So this ends up playing a big part in his argument. Every proof may be referred to one of these three divisions: the evidence of the senses, reason, and testimony. First, the evidence of the senses. If the deity should appear to us, if he should convince our senses of his existence, this revelation would necessarily command belief. Those to whom the deity has thus appeared have the strongest possible conviction of his existence. But the God of theologians is incapable of local visibility. Second reason, it is urged that man knows that whatever is must either have had a beginning or have existed from all eternity. He also knows that whatever is not eternal must have had a cause. When this reasoning is applied to the universe, it is necessary to prove that it was created. Until that is clearly demonstrated, we may reasonably suppose that it has endured from all eternity. Okay. We must prove design before we can infer a designer. In a case where two propositions are diametrically opposite, the mind believes that which is least incomprehensible, kind of like an Occam's razor, like one that is least far-fetched, you could say, the least incomprehensible. It is easier to suppose that the universe has existed from all eternity than to conceive of a being beyond its limits capable of creating it. And then third, testimony. It is required that testimony should not be contrary to reason. The testimony that the deity convinces the senses of men of his existence can only be admitted by us if our mind considers it less probable that these men should have been deceived than that the deity should appear to them. And this is the David Hume's argument. Is it more likely God really did appear to people or that they were somehow deceived? I think we know the answer to that question. Our reason can never admit the testimony of men who not only declare that they were eyewitnesses of miracles, but that the deity was irrational. For he commanded that he should be believed. He proposed the highest rewards for faith, eternal punishments for disbelief, but belief is not an act of volition. In other words, why reward or punish us when we can't help, especially why punish us when we can't help what we believe? That's irrational. So that's what he means when he says the deity is irrational to have proposed this system. From this, it is evident that we have no sufficient testimony, or rather that testimony is insufficient to prove the being of a God. Hence, it is evident that having no proofs from either of the three sources of conviction, the evidence of the senses, reason, and testimony, the mind cannot believe the existence of a creative God. Every reflecting mind must acknowledge that there is no proof of the existence of a deity. And this is where the original 1811 pamphlet ended. And then he goes on in the notes to Queen Mab. This is all duplicated in the notes to Queen Mab. And then now here's some new material that he added. God is an hypothesis, and as such stands in need of proof. God is represented as infinite, eternal, incomprehensible. Even his worshippers allow that it is impossible to form any idea of him. They exclaim with the French poet, "To say what he is, you have to be him." And Shelley quotes from a lot of people in the notes. One of the people he quotes is Bacon. Lord Bacon says that atheism leaves to man reason, philosophy, natural piety, laws, reputation, and everything that can serve to conduct him to virtue. But superstition destroys all these and erects itself into a tyranny over the understandings of men. Hence, atheism never disturbs the government, but renders man more clear-sighted, since he sees nothing beyond the boundaries of the present life. And then he goes into a lengthy quotation from The System of Nature by Baron de Holbach. And the original, in Shelley's publication, this is all in the original French, and this is an English translation of that. The first theology of man made him first fear and adore the elements themselves, the gross and material objects of nature. He next paid homage to the agents controlling the elements, lower genies, heroes, or men gifted with great qualities. By force of reflection, he sought to simplify things by submitting all nature to a single agent, spirit, or universal soul, which gave movement to nature in all its branches. Mounting from cause to cause, mortal man has ended up by seeing nothing. And it is in this obscurity that he is placed as God. So, we can sort of figure out a chain of cause and effect back so far, and then we're just guessing. It is in this darksome abyss that his uneasy imagination has always labored to fabricate chimeras, which will continue to afflict him until his knowledge of nature chases these phantoms, which he has always so adored. So it's basically God of the gaps. We don't know what's happening. We say God did it. We don't really know anything about this God, how he does anything. But then when we learn more, then we can chase the phantom God out of this gap. If we wish to explain our ideas of the divinity of God, we shall be obliged to admit that by the word God, man has never been able to designate but the most hidden, the most distant, the most unknown cause of the effects which he saw. He has made use of this word only when the play of natural and known causes ceased to be visible to him. As soon as he lost the thread of these causes, or when his mind could no longer follow the chain, he cut the difficulty and ended his researches by calling God the last of the causes. That is to say, that which is beyond all causes that he knew. Thus, he but assigned a vague denomination to an unknown cause, at which his laziness or the limits of his knowledge forced him to stop. Every time we say that God is the author of some phenomenon, that signifies that we are ignorant of how such a phenomenon was able to operate by the aid of forces or causes that we know in nature. If ignorance of nature gave birth to gods, knowledge of nature is made for their destruction. Man's terrors dissipated in the same proportion as his mind became enlightened. The educated man ceases to be superstitious. For thousands of years, the lazy dreamers have perpetually relieved one another, one in succession, to meditate on the divinity, to divine his secret will, to invent the proper hypotheses, to develop this important enigma. The more an object conceals itself from our eyes, the greater the effort we make to seize it, because it pricks our pride, it excites our curiosity, and it appears interesting. In fighting for his God, everyone, in fact, fights only for the interests of his own vanity. If God wishes to be known, cherished, thanked, why does he not show himself under his favorable features to all these intelligent beings by whom he wishes to be loved and adored? Why not manifest himself to the whole earth in an unequivocal manner, much more capable of convincing us than these private revelations, which seem to accuse the divinity of an annoying partiality to some of his creatures? Why does he just, pick out some people? Why is he partial to some people to reveal himself? Why not just reveal himself to everybody? If he is infinitely good, what reason should we have to fear him? If he is infinitely wise, why should we have doubts concerning our future? If he knows all, why warn him of our needs and fatigue him with our prayers? If he's everywhere, why erect temples to him? If he is just, why fear that he will punish the creatures that he has filled with weakness? If he's all powerful, how offend him? How resist him? If he is reasonable, how can he be angry at the blind to whom he has given the liberty of being unreasonable? If he is immovable, by what right do we pretend to make him change his decrees? If he is inconceivable, why occupy ourselves with him? If the knowledge of God is the most necessary, why is it not the most evident and the clearest? If he has spoken, why is the universe not convinced? Some other notes that were in Queen Mab regarding religion. If God is the author of good, he is also the author of evil. If he's entitled to our gratitude for the one, he's entitled to our hatred for the other. The same means that have supported every other popular belief have supported Christianity. War, imprisonment, assassination, and falsehood, deeds of unexampled and incomparable atrocity have made it what it is. The blood shed by the votaries or evangelists of the God of mercy and peace, since the establishment of his religion, would probably suffice to drown all the other sectaries, peoples of other religions, now on the habitable globe. Well, that's pretty good for a 20-year-old. I don't know if that I could have come up with all this at that age. So what was some of the feedback, the result of this publication? Well, he sent the initial pamphlet, The Necessity of Atheism, to his father, Timothy Shelley, copy to his father. And the father wrote on the cover, impious. You can see the script there. And I think, knowing Shelley, we could also pronounce that a different way, impious. He was quite the rabble rouser, pretty much all his life, but especially at this time. Now, years later, Shelley went on to marry Harriet Westbrook. Well, actually, it was maybe about within a year after being unable to marry Harriet Grove, he married Harriet Westbrook. And they went on to have kids together. And then she committed suicide. So in 1817, after the death of his first wife, Harriet Westbrook, who had committed suicide 3 months earlier, Percy Shelley petitioned the court for custody of their two very young children, Ianthe and Charles. However, Shelley had previously abandoned his family 2.5 years earlier and had taken off to mainland Europe with Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, whom he now married shortly after Harriet's death. And in fact, when Shelley took off with Mary, his first wife, Harriet, he was still married to his first wife, Harriet, and she was pregnant with Charles. She hadn't even given birth yet. So he abandons his young child, Ianthe, he abandons Harriet, who's pregnant with Charles, runs off to Europe with Mary. And when he's in Europe, he gets word that Harriet has committed suicide. So he goes back to England. And Harriet's father, John Westbrook, with the aid of Harriet's sister, Eliza Westbrook, opposed Shelley's petition for custody of the children, and he now sought custody himself. As part of his case, John Westbrook cited Percy Shelley's failure to visit his children during the time he had run off with Mary to Europe, of mainland Europe, and the atheism in Queen Mab. In the end, neither party was awarded custody of the children. They were given to foster parents, and Shelley and the Westbrooks were given visitation rights. So that's one fallout of Shelley's atheism in the publication of Queen Mab. In 1821, so 8 years after the original publication of Queen Mab, and again, Queen Mab was only 250 copies, just like The Necessity of Atheism had been, and most of these copies, they weren't destroyed, but they hadn't been distributed. So in 1821, while Shelley was in Italy, he received news from London that someone had put out a pirated edition of Queen Mab. And this brought numerous reviews, new life, and further printings of the poem. Shelley would not have been able to stop the pirated publication of this work because English copyright law at the time did not apply to works that were seditious, blasphemous, defamatory, or obscene. The Society for the Suppression of Vice in England twice tried to stop this publication and distribution, but ultimately failed. So the Society did stop the first republication. The person who was selling the pirated edition of Queen Mab did withdraw it from sale, but since it was not under copyright, other people picked it up and started publishing it, and ultimately the Society for the Suppression of Vice was not able to stop it. And Because of this, it became one of Shelley's most widely read publications. If they had let Shelley have his copyright, he could have stopped or at least controlled the publication of this, but he had no control, and so it just really proliferated. And this is from an unsigned review that appeared in the Literary Gazette, and you can see 1821, so it's after this republication. This is an excerpt from it. We have spoken of Shelley's genius, and it is doubtless of a high order. But when we look at the purposes to which it is directed and contemplate the infernal character of all its efforts, our souls revolt with tenfold horror at the energy it exhibits. And we feel as if one of the darkest fiends had been clothed with a human body. So strongly has this impression dwelt upon our minds that we asked a friend who has seen this individual to describe him to us, as if a cloven foot or horn or flames from his mouth must have marked the external appearance of so bitter an enemy to mankind. We were almost disappointed to learn that the author was only a tall, boyish-looking man with eyes of unearthly brightness and a countenance of the wildest cast, that he strode about with hurried and impatient gait, and that a perturbed spirit seemed to preside over all his movements. Okay. Well, going back a few years earlier, now we're kind of leaving the Necessity of Atheism in the Queen Mab at this point, going back to 1816. So this was after the official publication of Queen Mab. And Shelley was in Europe, in France and Italy and Switzerland, with Mary Shelley at the time, and Byron too, Lord Byron the poet. So in the summer of 1816, Shelley wrote in the registers of 3 hotels in the valley of Chamonix in France that his occupation was a lover of humanity, a Democrat, and an atheist, and that his destination was hell. And to the right here, you see this is an actual ledger page from the hotel that resurfaced maybe 10 or 20 years ago. And I'm going to zoom in here. So this is from the register of the Hotel de Ville in Londres, Chamonix. So the day is, Juillet is French for July. So the 23rd of July, 1816. Name, Percy Bysshe Shelley. And that is kind of wild. I mean, this is actual handwriting. Percy Bysshe Shelley. Under it, we have MAD MWG, and that's stood for Madame Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. They were not married yet, so she was still going by Godwin. City and country of origin, that's Sussex. You probably remember that back in like the old days, sometimes an S looked more like an F, so that you have an SU, and then there's actually 2 S's there, EX. So Sussex, London, England. Destination, l'enfer, French for hell. So they're both going to hell. And then for occupation, Shelley only wrote this top line, and this is in Greek, and it translates as, I am a lover of humanity, a Democrat, and an atheist. Well, then someone else came along and wrote something below that. This is not Shelley. Someone wrote in Greek as well, the famous Bible verse that says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And whoever did this underlined the word fool, and then underlined Percy Bysshe Shelley to have there be no mistake who he meant by fool. Okay. Well, the death of Shelley. Again, he was just about a month shy of turning 30. Shelley and 2 companions drowned in a storm in the Gulf of La Spezia, Italy. You can see it on the map here. While sailing Shelley's schooner called the Don Juan, which was named after a long poem by Lord Byron. And the area where he drowned is now referred to as the Bay of Poets. His badly decomposed body was found on shore 10 days later. He was identified by his clothing in a copy of a poem by Keats that he had in his pocket. He was cremated on the beach because they were too afraid of disease to bring him into town to cremate or bury him. You just imagine a 10-day-old body on the shore. So he's cremated right on the beach, but his heart resisted burning, possibly due to calcification from an earlier tubercular infection. Well, the heart was retrieved from the ashes and eventually was given to his wife, Mary Shelley. Meanwhile, the rest of his remains are buried in Rome. And Shelley's heart, which had been given to Mary, was eventually buried with her in England. So most of Shelley's remains are here in Rome, in a non-Catholic cemetery of Rome. And there's a society, the Keats Shelley Society is headquartered there, and they maintain this grave. And there's a quote from Shakespeare, and considering how Shelley drowned and his sort of strange views about spirituality, or nebulous views, I should say, a great quote from Shakespeare's The Tempest: "Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange." Poetic justice. Well, Oxford kicked Shelley out in 1810. Now they have this huge monument, this memorial to Shelley at Oxford, and shows him as if he's been washed up to shore, which he was washed up to shore, but of course his body was decayed. So they have this big memorial to him at Oxford. And elsewhere in England, they have another memorial to Mary Shelley and Percy, and this is supposed to be Mary holding the dead body of Shelley, who had been washed ashore. Of course, this never would have happened in reality. I don't think she would have been holding a corpse that had been decayed for 10 days. But anyway, it's a very nice image. Okay. Well, that's it for the presentation. I used a lot of sources to put this together. And if any of you would like, if you're watching a recording, you can pause it and write some of these down. I'd be happy to send them to you. Maybe Minnesota Atheists can put it in their notes section. I can send it to them as a PDF as well. So that's the presentation, and can take some questions now. And try to get out of this. Okay, see if I can get back to Zoom. Here we go. Okay. So any questions? Can people hear me? Okay.
So I have one, August, which is really only back to your last slide of Oxford. Why do they justify having a memorial of sorts at all? Just to recognize that he passed through there?
Yeah, I mean, he had been there, and he's now a famous poet. And actually, his fame came years after he died. His publications were usually self-published in quantities of about 250, and he was known in literary circles. He was known in. He was also active politically, but really I would say the average person in England had never heard of him during his lifetime, and his fame really grew afterwards. And I guess Oxford kind of it's their way of admitting their mistake. I think this memorial was actually paid for by outside funds, but of course they had to agree to have it on their grounds, and they did.
And sorry, since I'm on a roll here, do you happen to know what a typical cost might have been for the self-publication? Did he have quite a bit of money, or is this something that was so cheap that it was a trivial cost?
I don't think the cost was great. I showed you the covers of a couple of his publications, very bare bones, just text. Now, this is an interesting thing. He had an allowance from his father, but after the Necessity of Atheism, the father cut off the allowance. And so for many years, he was in debt, really, really struggling, sometimes moving around to stay one step ahead of the people he owed money to and the law. I think he even went to jail for a day or two because of this. Eventually, his grandfather died, and his grandfather left him a bunch of money. And I think the father also restored his allowance too. So eventually he had some money, but he had, I'd say maybe 5 years where he had very little money. Yeah.
About when did he become, I don't know, his poetry become more popular, right? Was it like right after the kind of republication while he was alive? The one that was the, I don't know, not him doing the publication.
It was mainly the efforts of his widow, Mary, and some of his friends pushing to publish some of these things after he died, getting him more distribution, and recognition started to grow that, hey, this guy really could write some really good poetry. Yeah, you really should look up Ozymandias. You've probably all learned it in school. It's, you know, such a great poem, and it's very short.
Well, I guess I'm always struck by how some things have never changed over time.
Yes.
I mean, the whole thing is, well, of course he's condemned, the person's condemned to hell because they have views that are outside of the norm. And it's the exact same thing today. Oh, well, they're against humanity. They're going to be condemned to hell. And it's just amazing that even when you were showing some of the quotes, the arguments haven't changed. It's just the language has changed over the years. You use it probably under some of those arguments when you've debated many times.
Yeah.
And you know, you got 200, how much time in between you? And it just strikes me as all we're doing is reinventing the wheel or having the same discussion. But that's all right. So we'll all be in hell together. So it'll be an enjoyable place.
Well, online, Andy Flam asks, can you tell us anything about Mary? Shelley had been not permitted to marry the first love of his life, Harriet Grove. I suspect he was kind of on the rebound when he married Harriet Westbrook and had 2 children with her. And then he was introduced to William Godwin. William Godwin had married, what's her first name? Wollstonecraft. Maybe it was Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women. And Mary Wollstonecraft died in childbirth, giving birth to Mary. And Shelley ran off with Mary. She was, I think, only 16 at the time. They ran off to Europe. They fell in love. Shelley went over to Godwin's house, met Mary. They fell in love. They ran off to Europe. During, I think it probably was the summer of 1816, they had that famous competition to write a ghost story. And Mary Shelley came up with the bare bones outline of Frankenstein, which Percy Shelley then encouraged her to flesh out into a longer story. Now, while they were in Europe, mainland Europe, they got word of Harriet Westbrook's death, Shelley's first wife. So they went back, and Shelley knew he was going to have to fight the Westbrooks for custody of his children. And he was told that if only he would marry Mary, that would increase his odds. Almost for sure he'd get custody of the kids if he did that. So even though Shelley always preached against marriage, here he married Harriet Westbrook, he married Mary Shelley, but it didn't help. He didn't end up getting custody of her kids. Mary Shelley went on to publish Frankenstein. When it first came out, it was anonymous. It's amazing how many things were first published anonymously back then. but then it eventually was republished with her name on the cover. Shelley had some input into it. It might have been just kind of the job like of an editor, looking over her drafts, making some suggestions, that kind of thing. But her name is the only one that appears in the publication, and he never tried to take any credit for anything. There are some that say that he contributed a lot to Frankenstein, that there's a scene in Zastrowski that kind of reappears in Frankenstein. So I don't know to what degree he helped. He helped a little for sure, but she's given sole credit for authorship, and she lived quite a long time after he died and was responsible for getting his work out there. Probably without her, he might still be very obscure. So I don't know if Andy, if that answers your question, or if you wanted to know anything else. Okay, you're welcome.
Well, an alternative look at this guy would be that he married a woman, had 2 kids, left them to their own devices while he was poor, so he wasn't paying any child support. And
He actually was sending some money
dead.
back. He actually was sending some money back. Even though he had abandoned them, he was sending some money back to try to help them. But yeah, he was a jerk for abandoning his family, no doubt about it. But he had fallen out of love with her. But so he sometimes referred to it as his duty. When he would write about the marriage to friends, he'd call it his duty. So he stayed with her out of that. But eventually he did run off. So, and while she was pregnant, I mean, that's really the worst. That makes it even worse to have done it. Sorry, did you want to say some more? Kind of interrupted you.
Oh, no, I just kind of find it odd that Oxford would memorialize a guy who was a jerk like that.
Well, most people know about his poetry and not the fact that he was a jerk. So, yeah.
So did he get minimally pushed back for any specific religious group, including in the Catholic Church, directly attack his position? Or was he so small and isolated that they, as organizations, did not really care about him?
Yeah, I mean, The Necessity of Atheism had 250 copies, and he was 18. And he claimed he just wanted to put the arguments out there. He was so pissed that the engagement to Harriet Grove had been called off because of just for his opinions at that point. So he was really pissed at the Catholic Church, and that I think spurred him to write this. But yeah, he would have been too much of a small fry. And even Queen Mab, when it came out, he was still only 20, 250 copies. Most didn't get distributed at the time. So the Catholic Church, I doubt, made any sort of official pushback. And Oxford did expel him, but it was as much because he wouldn't admit that he wrote it as for the contents. Yeah.
Any
Any
more
other-
questions?
I'm sorry the presentation was so text heavy, but
You
How
almost
do you
have to
really
put the
get-
text up there to absorb it all.
yeah, I mean, so I tried to read it with some inflection to make it a little bit interesting.
I thought it was. Let's give
Yeah.
Augustine another round of applause. Thank you.
Well, you're certainly welcome.
All right. Well, I will conclude this meeting of Minnesota Atheists. I suppose if you wanted to stay on for a little bit longer, you're welcome to, but otherwise I'll call this meeting complete. So thank you for attending.